was based on minimizing disorder, loss due to disorder. The modern economy really, the IT economy really ignores the content completely and maximizes minus of the disorder, which is actually asset. So the formula for information is exactly the same as the formula for entropy with a minus sign. So I think that's not an accident. It's mathematically well founded. So really you're looking at the services sector where you're doing ordering. But in the manufacturing sector, you have a content and you're minimizing loss. The mathematics is the same, that luckily for academics. But I think both sectors are going to be important. We have certain raw material advantages, we have certain advantages, and ultimately manufacturing is far too important for us to ignore.
Sir, last question to you, sir.
I'm Jayanto Chatterjee from IIT Kanpur. I have a couple of questions for Dr. Sumantran. You showed about 6 point some percentage differential in the cost between India and China in that total makeup due to engineering design. So if you could throw a little light on what lies under that differential. And secondly, while there was good comparison between India and China at macro level in terms of competitiveness and what lies under that, at an individual organization level, for example, have you benchmarked Tata Motors with a comparable organization, may not be in automotive, but in other sector in China versus another one in America or Europe? And so what lies under the individual organization's competitiveness? How do you metric or measure that in Tata Motors?
Let me first preface what I'm going to say by saying that no stereotypes are really truly universally valid. Having said that, let me first start with the 6-point advantage that we saw in the comparison, because what it was an India cost a number of advantages to China and then a 6-point advantage in favor of India, aggregating to a net 23% loss for India. Actually, that 6%, which is very sizable out of that 23, comes from the advantage that India has in terms of engineering skills and development capability. Let me give you an example. I have visited several large Chinese automakers, and it's not uncommon when you visit them that everything you will be shown is on a grand scale. They like to talk about everything being done on a grand scale. So you walk down the entry of the manufacturing facility and you will see a press shop with a full line of the latest German presses. You walk into the weld shop and you will see a fully automated robotic controlled weld shop from Sweden. You go to the paint shop, it's the latest German paint shop, commissioned and constructed by the German consultant. Now when we do this in Tata Motors, we go ahead and buy the mainframe presses from the same German company, but we engineer and execute most of it ourselves. We go into the weld shop and buy all the robo-skeletons from the same Swedish company, but we instrument it, automate it, execute it completely with our own resources. Right down to all of the programmable logic controllers, the material handling systems are all designed, developed, and built inside India, in fact, inside Tata Motors. So as a result, the number of dollars we need to commission a plant becomes a small fraction of what a Chinese automaker would have to commission, because they just have to open their checkbook and write a check to the German company or the Swedish company or the American company. And this multiplies the cost that they would have to incur, which leads to the investment advantage that I had referred to in a slide earlier. So the 6 rupees or the 6% of advantage comes from the fact that when we design the Indica, it's designed by Indian engineers and Indian scientists, where necessary with the right amount of technology from the European or the Japanese players, but predominantly done and engineered in India. The comparable Chinese example would be a complete turnkey job offered for design and development to a Western consultancy. And so that is the source of this engineering cost disadvantage. Now in terms of benchmarking organizations in terms of what they are, Frankly, we've spent more time benchmarking ourselves against the best companies in the world in the auto sector. So we've really not looked at benchmarking ourselves against Chinese automakers, although we have a good enough understanding of most of them to understand where they're competitive and what's the source of their competitive advantage vis-a-vis ourselves. But we've spent more time focusing on the best in class.
I'm Sanjay Gupta from National Institute of Fashion Technology. This question arises out of a presentation of Professor Anand. However, I leave it open for any speaker. Out of the growth areas which you mentioned, sir, quite a few like textile, leather, gems and jewelry, handicrafts, they're all highly labor-intensive industries. And the education and the skill level in these industries are not very high, but of a lower intensity. And from our experience, we have found that the competitiveness of an industry in this sector is marred by the productivity of the labor. And the issue which is raised in those forums is not education, but the work culture and the kind of work ethics which are being followed. Has that been factored in anywhere in your calculation, or has any best practices being offered about it?
It's actually not my calculation per se, but I preface my remarks by saying that employment is also an important thing in India. We're going to have a very large labor force. In many of these cases, there is a sophisticated end and there is a back end. The back end is very labor intensive, and that portion will provide employment, but it's still, on a large scale, it's still doable. And I think it's necessary in in the Indian context that you also provide employment while preserving the competitiveness. I'm not saying we know exactly how to do this, but like Sumantran said some time ago, it has to be done. Don't have a choice. I think we'll find a way of doing it. Would you like to add?
See, good evening, sir. Yeah, I'm Dr. Gajaveli V.S. I'm with IMT as a professor of economics and finance. My question is, it has two sets. The first question, I think both the questions are to Mr. V. Sumantran. The first question is, looking at the India incorporated the growth trajectory in terms of its the market potential going by GDP growth rates, and looking at the composition of GDP, I think we have seen the figures, and looking back 2 to 3 decades, I think the share of agriculture has come down considerably, but it continues to support more or less the same amount of workforce, whereas the share of manufacturing and that of this services sector has gone up. Especially the services contribution to GDP has gone up, but their contribution towards employment generation is almost nil. I would like to know to what extent this kind of development, especially the future of manufacturing, can be sustainable when the demand potential is in the countryside and whose incomes are dependent on agriculture and allied activities, whose per capita incomes are coming down steeply. So how far the whole development process as such can be sustainable? This is my first set of questions. The second one, sir, when you are talking in terms of Indian companies going global, becoming multinationals, I think the Tata Group is one of the best examples. But my question is the growth is essentially driven by selling the products overseas or by exploiting the kind of domestic demand that the India possesses? This is the second question, sir.
I'm not sure I understood the specific point on the second question. Let me take the first one of an improved economy to the entire population. If you take the auto industry, for example, and I will ask to be excused because if I keep referring back to this industry, but it is a valid example. The auto industry contributes to about 6.2% of India's GDP, but it also contributes to over 9% of employment creation in the country. Now, if you extend this to machine tools and if you extend this to other industries, you can start looking at a different shadow that is being created by growth in the manufacturing sector, which typically means that you're creating jobs that are further up the value chain and are able to generate more per capita or per unit GDP for every unit of employment generated. I think ultimately we will have to steer the country's course in a direction where more and more of our very large population can ultimately have a better standard of living, which means per person productivity in whatever form, as far as GDP is concerned, has to grow. And today it is well demonstrated that per person output of agriculture can be far, far greater in India today than it is actually. So I think over a longer period of time it's inevitable that the percentage of population engaged in agriculture will drop. And I think it's important, as we discussed earlier, that amongst other industries, whether it's IT, whether it's pharma, whether it is manufacturing, they need to gear up to generate the kind of jobs we need in the country. As far as the exports are concerned, frankly, I think, as I attempted to explain, exports would be needed for Indian organizations for two reasons. One is, at some stage you've got to grow beyond your market. Whether you like it or not, every overseas manufacturer is going to be here in your market. And if you want to continue to grow, you better find other markets to grow beyond the shelter of your own market. The second thing is, you really have to go out and face the world. If it is true today that many of the markets in Europe or North America are even more crowded and even more competitive than ours, we have to learn to fight it out in those markets and be successful, adopt the technologies that are necessary to be competitive in those markets, if only to at least remain as competitive as we are with an onslaught of more and more players in India. So I think our exports initiative does not come at the sacrifice or the neglect of the domestic market. Rather, it is undertaken to ensure further competitiveness of our position in the domestic market. I hope I've answered your question.
We'll take one last question now.
Yeah, you answered my question, sir. My concern here being, it's basically in terms of country competitiveness, China vis-a-vis India. So if something really goes wrong with the overseas markets, China can really depend on the domestic demand. Whereas looking at India's domestic demand, if something happens to the overseas demand, whether India is in a position to sustain that kind of a external shock. I mean, from that point of view, to what extent the governments as well as the corporates are becoming more and more proactive to make the domestic market demand much more sustainable? I mean, in the context of the previous question.
Do you want to speak that? In fact, recent studies have shown that there are two fundamental differences between the Chinese economy and the Indian economy. The first very fundamental difference is actually somewhat a little different from what you're saying, which is the Chinese economy is significantly dependent on the export market. And FDIs have substantially come in for the purpose of serving the export market because they are not able to compete in the deeply discounted government-sponsored internal market of China. Whereas it's exactly the reverse. The developments in India have substantially been with regard to the Indian market. We do have exports, but our percentage of exports to domestic consumption is significantly lower than what it is in China. The second, which is again a very stark difference between China and India, and again considered by people like Tom Friedman, who's written the book World is Flat and things like that. A very fundamental difference between China and India today is that the Chinese economy has been fueled by a substantially foreign direct investment, whereas the Indian economy has been substantially fueled by homegrown entrepreneurship. And it is believed that the latter model has a far more sustainable future than the former. And the example that Tom Friedman gives is, he says, when I look at China, I feel I'm driving on a 4-lane highway, but I see a very large road bump ahead. And when I look at India, I may be driving on a potholed road today, but I see a 4-lane highway ahead.
The gentleman in the pink shirt, and this would be the last question we'll probably take, so.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Amit Agarwal I'm working with Sterlite Industries, and my question is to the entire panel itself. What we discussed on this topic was like, I personally felt that we were discussing about something like bureaucracy, regulatory framework, taxes, interest, something like that. But nothing much was discussed about the role of the industry as such. Most of the emphasis, the only emphasis I found was something like research and development. But I would like to ask, why were we so late on implementing in techniques like Six Sigma, LAN, TPM, appointing big consultants like McKinsey, BCG, when we have seen that they have turned around big corporates abroad? And what would have been the position if this had been done at a bit early stage? Had we been in front of China, or the position would have been same? Or my question is wrong, in fact? Please.
You know, I think any attempt to defend or speak on behalf of what Indian industry has done to improving its competitiveness can sound like nothing more than what it is, defensiveness. So rather than take that approach, let me say, at the end of the day, any sense of competitiveness in a market that is relatively open like India is ultimately measured in the marketplace.